Welcome, everyone. We're going to kick things off in a few minutes. That's where everyone's coming in.
A lot of familiar names.
All right, should we go ahead and get started? So welcome everyone to the second symposium of the Black Sheep Society. I'm so happy to be here, to be your host for the day. My name is Julia Alekseyeva. I'm an assistant professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, but I also work with Slavic literatures and film, and have a book coming out next year on anti-fascism and the avant-garde, radical documentary in the 1960s. So I'm very excited to introduce our speakers, but first a little note about the Black Sheep Society. We are a recently formed interdisciplinary group of scholars in Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies, working within the tradition of leftist analysis and critique, broadly construed, within a field still structured by Cold War binaries and increasingly by neoliberal imperatives. We seek to provide an intellectual home for scholars at all career levels who share a commitment to overturning these reigning conservative and liberal paradigms. The Black Sheep Society aims to build structure and shape for critical research and to foster connections between leftist academics and activists in the region. And if you are not yet plugged in, you can join our Google group. We also have a Facebook page and more sort of social media coming soon. Rennie, if you don't mind posting the link to sign up in the chat, I'd love to have you. So we're very, very thankful today to have four incredible scholars who are joining us, who are have paved the way for so many of us to work on leftism in this field and in other fields. And I'm going to go ahead and first introduce our speakers, and then we'll start with a few kind of guiding questions, and everyone will take a few minutes to respond, and then after we go through a few questions, we'll open it up to question and answers from all of you. So please, if you have any questions, we'd love to have them at after the remarks from our speakers. So first, I'd like to introduce Louis Siegelbaum, who is Jack and Margaret's Sweet Professor Emeritus of History at Michigan State University, where he taught Russian and European history from 1983 until 2018. He is the author of books on Soviet labor and social history, as well as the award-winning Cars from Comrades from 2008. His memoir, Stuck on Communism, Memoir of a Russian Historian, was published in 2019 and the Russian edition in 2020. In addition, he co-authored with Leslie Page, Broad as My Native Land, Repertoires and Regimes of Migration in Russia's 20th Century from 2014. He has edited 2 books and co-edited 6 others, most recently Reflections on Stalinism from 2024 with J. Arch Getty. He also co-authored with James von Geldern the prize-winning online sourcebook, 17 Moments in Soviet History. He has written for The Nation, the Times Literary Supplement, the Moscow Times, and other journals. Then we have Maria Todorova, Gutzel Professor of History Emerita at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She is the author of Imagining the Balkans. The revised edition came out in 2009, which has been translated into 15 languages, as well as numerous other books on Balkan, Ottoman, and modern Bulgarian history. Most recently, The Lost World of Socialists at Europe's Margins, Imagining Utopia from 2020. She led large-scale international research projects, resulting in several edited and co-edited volumes, most recently Post-Communist Nostalgia from 2010 and Remembering Communism from 2014. She has held awards from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Wissenschaft Kolleg zu Berlin, and numerous other institutions, and is the recipient of honorary degrees from the European University Institute in Italy, the University of Sofia, Bulgaria, and Pantheon University in Greece, and Fanoli University in Albania. In 2022, she received the Distinguished Contributions to Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies Award, and was elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Then we have David Ost, who is a just now retiring professor of politics at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York. He has written widely on Eastern Europe with a focus on labor, class, democracy, and the radical right, particularly, but not only in Poland, where he has also frequently taught. His books include Solidarity and the Politics of Anti-Politics, Workers After Workers' States, The Defeat of Solidarity, and the edited collection Class After Communism. Recent articles include Why Which Workers Often Oppose Which Democracy, Rejecting Lenin for the Left, and the surprising right-wing relevance of the Russian Revolution. He is currently completing a book titled Red Pill Politics on the essential sameness of fascism and right-wing populism. And last but not least, we have Elena Gapova, a professor and Department of Sociology, Western Michigan University. She was the founding director of the Center for Gender Studies at European Humanities University in Minsk, which is currently Belarusian University in Exile in Vilnius, Lithuania. She has written on gender, nationalism, and class and post-socialism, as well as on intellectuals, the production of knowledge, and cyberspace. One of her books is The Classes of Nations, the Feminist Critique of Nation Building. So thank you to our fantastic speakers and scholars. I'm just thrilled to have all of you here. And I'm sure I speak for everyone here when I'm just so happy that you've all agreed to join us in this great conversation. And the first question that I was hoping to ask all of you to just start the conversation is just if you could tell us a little bit about your political trajectory. So how did you come to leftism? And you can kind of expand from there, but we'll just start off with maybe 5 to 7 minutes from each of you, and then we'll go on to the next question. So why don't we start with Louis? And I can bring up your PowerPoint and have it in the back of the screen. So
thank you, Julia. Thank you, Rawson. Thank you, everyone associated with Black Sheep for putting this together. It's great to see so many people here, some of whom I recognize by their names, many of whom I don't. Anyway, I'm going to talk about that part of my career when I was a labor historian, essentially the first 25 years or so after I got my doctorate in 1976. And then I'm going to turn to something much more recent. As a labor historian, I was part of a cohort of young scholars, roughly my age. Before we discovered one another, for all intents and purposes, I want to point out there was no such thing as Soviet labor history, not at least in the Anglophone world. As everyone knew, workers, being under the thumb of administrators with no independent trade unions or voice of their own, had no agency. And so the conventional wisdom was better to leave it, or anything to do with workers, to the political scientists who knew how to read between the lines of what Lenin, Stalin, and company had in store for the proletariat. I should mention that Soviet history of any kind was still in its infancy, because to do history that would be recognized as such, again following the conventional criteria, required archival sources, and Soviet-era archives were off limits to foreign scholars, with 1 or 2 exceptions, Sheila Fitzpatrick being the best known. This was a general rule of sorts throughout the historical profession, but probably meant more in our case, because of course, everything published in the Soviet Union was under strict control of the party and its vast censorial administration, and therefore couldn't be trusted. So to study workers was in itself something of a political decision, one made in defiance of the Cold War consensus within the profession. That consensus did begin to break down in the 1970s with questioning by political scientists of the totalitarian paradigm, and was further eroded in the late 1970s with the fruits of research by Sheila Fitzpatrick, Misha Levin, and a few other historians who boldly ventured into the 1920s and 30s of Soviet history. But I remember attending the Second World Congress on Soviet and East European Studies held in West Germany in October 1980, and being struck by how many young scholars, the likes of Don Filzer, John Russell, Paddy Dale, Francesco Benvenuti, Vladimir Anderly, an internationally eclectic, although all-male group. These people beginning to tackle topics specifically on Soviet workers. They soon would be joined by Diane Conker, Wendy Goldman, Mary Buckley, and others. I can't speak for them, but for me, a belated inspiration was the work of E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. As Thompson famously put it, the book rescued its subjects from the condescension of posterity. I would add it also emancipated them from their reduction to numbers, patterns, tendencies, and other abstractions favored by economic historians of that time and probably since. Of course, I realized that late 18th and early 19th century England was not like the 1920s and 30s in the Soviet Union. But as I later wrote in my memoir, and you can show that on the next slide, please. The sheer bravado with which EP calls up his actors, puts them on the stage, and describes the action both takes one's breath away and inspires. Ironically, the late 1970s and early 80s happened to coincide with the dawn of Thatcher and Reagan, the financialization of capital, and the reign of neoliberal ideology. It was not a very propitious time to assert the importance of workers and their agency. It's since occurred to me, though, that diving into such uniquely Soviet phenomena, later to be exported to communist Eastern Europe as, next slide, please, and there'll be a succession of slides, shock work, the next one, socialist competition, the next one, comrades' courts, and the next slide, please, Stakhanovite movement. And to find in these activities workers' agency, as well as their accommodation and acquiescence, this was my way of escaping from the disappointments of the period that Marxists at the time optimistically called late capitalism. So I did that right up until the end of the millennium while pursuing a few other projects. The most important of these was my involvement in the making of, next slide, please, Perestroika from Below, a video documentary film about the miners of Donetsk who had participated in the massive strikes among coal miners in 1989 and again in 1991 and 92. That is, across the Soviet, post-Soviet divide. Now, there was agency, or at least I thought so at the time. These miners and members of their families were the first and most meaningful direct contacts I had with living Soviet workers. Did I agree with their free market-oriented thinking? By no means. And yet in subtler ways, their outlook reflected their upbringing in Soviet society, something I can elaborate on later if you like. Anyway, this was part of the prehistory of the complicated relationship between Donbass and the rest of Ukraine, which itself is the prehistory of Putin's 2014 intervention and 2022 full-scale invasion. I want to end my remarks on a different note, though. I eventually abandoned labor history and my involvement in post-Soviet Ukrainian affairs to take up first, next slide, please, the history of the Soviet automobile, and then a different form of mobility. Next slide, please. Migration from late Imperial Russia throughout the Soviet period and pretty much up to the present. I've done other stuff too, but most recently, I've returned to the subject of Soviet workers, this time discursively. So, first a question. Have you ever heard of the Soviet Union and other former communist states being referred to, ironically, of course, as the workers' paradise? Next slide, please. Well, I have often, and so aided by newspapers.com, a search engine that gave me digital access to thousands of Anglophone newspapers, and combing through my personal library, I went in search of the origins of this locution. It turns out that no Soviet leader, not Lenin, nor Stalin, nor Trotsky, Bukharin, or Zinoviev, or anyone else, ever uttered this phrase, except in denial. The term has been around since the days of utopian socialism in Britain in the early 19th century. See The Making of the English Working Class, which cites Robert Owen to this effect. But Marxists, those self-described scientific socialists, disavowed it. Meanwhile, the bourgeois press adapted the term to refer to all kinds of white settler colonies like Australia, the American West, Canada, and so forth, where labor was scarce and wages high. But after 1917, it got new life as an anti-communist taunt. Next slide, please. A way of signaling how far from the cruel reality of communism. Next slide, please. Soviet propagandists allegedly had misled their own hapless citizens and naive pinko sympathizers abroad. And here I'll conclude. The phrase would continue to be used tauntingly throughout the Soviet era, extend to the rest of the Second World, and then appear retroactively up to the present, when the likes of the New York Times' Bret Stephens could deploy it just a few weeks ago. To answer the, I think, last question that Rosan and Julia have put to us for speakers, it is this kind of research, employing digital resources like newspapers.com, that strikes me as promising in the puncturing of a lot of myths about communism that have survived its demise. Also, one final plug. I just saw the Romanian film. Next slide, please. Do Not Expect Too Much of the End of the World, directed by Radu Jude. This wild and crazy film, juxtaposing life on the streets of Bucharest in 2023 with an actual Ceausescu-era film about a female taxi driver, could be a model of how to study late state socialism, in light of the capitalist paradise that has replaced it. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm actually planning on watching that movie tomorrow, so I cannot wait to see it. Wonderful. So next up, we have Maria Todorova. Go ahead, Maria, whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you. Thank you also to Louis Siegelbaum. This was excellent. I'm going to do something completely different. Less informative on my own scholarly career. It's there to be read. But let me start by expressing my admiration for this initiative. It is wonderful to have like-minded people around yourself. It is even more wonderful to have a critical mass of people who are like-minded. It seems that there is a critical mass at this point, close to 80 people. If they become too massive, that can also become critical. So take care. But then I have to admit, although I was very happy to see the announcement of the Black Sheep Society, and I was curious where it would go, I was reluctant to join. And it was really the persuasion and insistence of Rosen, and thank you, Rosen, that which was decisive. And I did eventually join. So I want to explain my reluctance. It stemmed from a generational difference. a rift, if you like, which can be also articulated as, I guess, different framing or different paradigms or different vocabularies that we come with in this thinking. And by generation, I don't mean age groups in a biological or, I don't know, demographic sense, but social, political generations, what Karl Mannheim described as a particular kind of location, which is embracing.
Okay, it looks like it's connected now. If there's not a problem, I'll let you know. It just.
Sorry?
Apologies, we've muted them, yeah. Please go ahead.
Okay, so I was quoting Mannheim. I was trying to paraphrase him actually, so that the generation is a particular kind of locality, if you like, or identity of location, which groups together people who are embedded in a particular, in the same historical social process. So in that sense, contemporaries, and we are contemporaries, and contemporaneity is a fact and a subjective condition of having been submitted to the same determining influences. However, Mannheim insisted on the formative role of youth and the decisiveness of these first triggering impressions or events. So young and old experience the same historical process. We all experience the same historical process, but we might even share the same broad ideals, but we have a different generational location. What some people call the stratification of experience. This is a notion that Mannheim, of course, introduced. And in parentheses, I have to say that I would have preferred our quartet to be called more experienced rather than wise, because yes, we probably have more experience, but wisdom is a different category. It does not necessarily follow experience, and it is not premised on experience. Wisdom is, I don't know, it comes with a very nuanced take on reality, with a very open-minded, acceptance of reality. And so I guess at moments we can be also wise, but only at moments. I don't know whether this is the moment. And then, of course, Mannheim distinguishes, and this is actually important, between an actual generation and then the generational units of the same actual generation, which experience in different ways or in different frames and with different vocabularies what is going on. So, I mean, this sounds too theoretical, so let me illustrate it anecdotally. Most of your black sheep society is coming out of the socialism, barbarism panels. And these are groups that are formed, I think, and some of the questions of Julia also alluded to that, that are formed by the momentous 1989 events and the subsequent, of course, disintegration of the Soviet Union. But I have to say, for me, 1989 was not formative at all. I welcomed it, of course, but my experience of a decaying already socialist system was pointing already in this direction. Although, of course, the exact timing was unexpected, of course. So to paraphrase your Chuck, of course, everything was forever until it was no more, but it was already no more while it was still professing to be forever. For me and for my generation. So for me, the formative years were the 1960s, and particularly 1968. This for me was the trigger rather than 89. So I grow up in Bulgaria in the 1960s. My teenage, my teenage life was there at a time when all of Eastern Europe was less repressive. It was the time of thaw, of cultural liberalization, and I participated in the summer of 1968 in this big, International Youth Festival, which was held in Sofia, where we had real revolutionaries from Latin America and militant revolutionaries from Western Germany, and a lot of hippies and a lot of Orthodox communists. And then in July, I was in Prague, which was a movable feast, really wonderful. And then August came with the invasion of the Warsaw Pact in Czechoslovakia. For me, this was a traumatic moment, which really shaped my worldview. Of course, after that, you have this repressive normalization. And in fact, my actual generation, and I'm speaking of the East European generations, of course, responded in different ways. So the largest generational unit opportunistically adapted itself to the times, and by the late 1970s and 1980s, they had embraced Reagan and Margaret Thatcher as their icons, and these were the people who came in and implemented the changes after '89 in very many ways. A smaller generation unit to which I probably belonged, although I always kept my individual independence, but still, was the one which was still harboring illusions that socialism with a human face could be saved by injecting it with liberalism and democracy. Now think how these words have evolved nowadays. 50 years later, liberalism means neoliberalism, and democracy, with all its ambiguities, means something terrible, even when people are not bombed into democracy, right? But 50 years earlier, it was different. So in a way, so in the first half of my academic life, which was in Eastern Europe, or the first half of my life, I was not challenging liberal orthodoxies, but in fact, I was challenging what posited itself as the official leftist orthodoxy or dogma, right? With liberalism, or trying to inject it with something different. So, and in the meantime, my own profession was Ottoman studies, which for me was a way to really clean myself out of political engagements, because it was difficult, because it was not fashionable to do. And I was challenging nationalism all the time, which funnily enough was the conservative ideology, having developed from a most radical left-wing ideology in the first half of the 19th century, right? So, and of course, after 1988, 89, in the US, I was reacting against conservative and liberal stereotypes toward the region, but also toward socialism and post-communism. So I guess I'm illustrating Marx's 18th Brumaire, where men think their own history, but they don't make it as they please. They do it, but under existing circumstances which are transmitted from the past. I probably paraphrase. So I will leave it at that for now.
Great. Thank you, Maria. I am reminded of trying to teach my students a few weeks ago Daisies by Vera Chytilova, and trying to explain the difference between the forms of communism and the blank faces received. So yeah, thank you so much. And next we have David Ost. Whenever you're ready, just go ahead and we'll unmute.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you so much for the invitation, Julia, Ross, and all the Black Sheep Society, which is doing such great work. So I'm gonna speak, we all have a different way of approaching this general question, how we came to our leftism and how political trajectory. So let me do it a little more personally, and also deal with, some issues that I confront in the academy from that personal background. So I grew up in a left family in New York City with parents who had left the Communist Party in 1956, just a year after I was born. And they left due to exasperation with the Communist Party that could not even begin to come to grips with the significance of Khrushchev's secret speech, right? That speech shook East European communist parties deeply, but in the US, it was pretty much swept under the rug, right? And my parents, who were active in American politics, of course, that was central. And Communist Party was a vehicle to fight racism, build unions, fight against war, et cetera, progressive causes being in the party. But nevertheless, they believed that the Soviet Union was, a worker state, that Stalin was a great hero. So 1956 shook them deeply, and the Communist Party USA really couldn't deal anything with it. Now, the CPUSA by 1956 had in any case become rather inert from the early 50s on, or even earlier when Earl Browder dissolved the Communist Party for a while. And by the early 1950s, it was inert due to McCarthyism and the Cold War. So leaving it in 1956 was not such a big thing. So this meant that my parents, as I grew up, became what we might today see as left liberals, progressives. They didn't talk about communism at all to us. And nor were they, in any case, did I grow up hearing great enthusiasm about the Soviet Union. Again, Khrushchev's secret speech shook that deeply out of them. They weren't attacking the Soviet Union. They didn't become, like those whose God had failed, as it were, didn't become right-wingers by any means, but the Soviet Union was kind of, we didn't learn much about it. My interest in that came from the formidable event that shaped my political life, which was the Vietnam War. Again, I'm born in 1955, so my parents took me to one of the first demonstrations against that war, perhaps in 1965, 66. Maybe I'm about 10 years old in New York City. And of course, this was when hardly anyone was protesting against it. In fact, when we walked down Fifth Avenue, there were more hecklers on the side of the street than there were the ones marching, holding up banners, better dead than red, go back to Russia. And I remember asking my parents, like, what's going on, and they kind of shrugged their shoulders and say, well, tell you later. But they never said, communism was something good, but still that I realized then that in order to understand American politics and intervene in American politics during that time, one would have to answer the question of what about the Soviet Union? Now, in some ways, I was rather lucky, fortunate. I went to a high school in New York that was about the only one at the time that offered Russian language. So I grabbed at that as something very different. And then I went to university at SUNY, Stony Brook, State University of New York, which ironically, or maybe it's not ironic, but it seems ironic now, this is not one of the top 10 Ivy League, et cetera, schools, but in the 1970s, early 70s, it was the only institution in the United States that developed some exchange programs with the Soviet Union. No other school had it. So I was going to SUNY. I was able to go to Leningrad in 1973 to do an exchange program in Moscow in 1975. My experience with, left politics, like how to find my own path, came when I was about 15. My politics were shaped by an encounter with a Trotskyist party, the Workers' League, as it was known, which fit my sensibility of, taking a position of a pox on both houses, right? You're not pro-American, you're not pro-Russian, you're, looking for some alternative, right? It was clear that the Soviet Union was no workers' paradise. I never believed in that at all, and this also meant that kind of developing interest in or hearing this kind of Trotskyist approach also made me interested in opposition movements in Eastern Europe. So, and this led to the fact that, after I did an exchange program in Moscow, I went to Poland first after that. And I soon switched my interest to Poland because I visited there in 1976, because it became clear that that's where opposition movements were starting to emerge, right? So in that sense, my trajectory, right? I had these left ideas, now understood that it was really important for American politics to understand my world, to understand what was going on there, to see what kind of opposition movements were emerging in Eastern Europe, was something that I always thought was politically important in the US as well. All of my work, I always feel like I study Eastern Europe because it's fascinating in itself, no doubt, but main interest for me is because of political commitments here, right, where I live. Obviously, I'm involved and got more involved with the translation of my books, in East European politics as well. But, grappling with these issues has been difficult. Now, in the academy, right, being a left critic of existing socialist societies was in the late 1970s when I was thinking about grad school, that didn't exist really anywhere, right? I did make sure when I was applying to graduate school not to apply to any of the top Ivy League schools, not to apply to any of the top universities in the East Coast, because they were absolutely filled with Cold Warriors, right? So, I knew I wasn't yet planning to be a PhD. I thought I'd become a journalist, but I wanted to, stay away from that Cold War influence. Who didn't seem to understand any changes. And of course, I was subsequently proved right. They were utterly bewildered and had nothing to say about changes that came in the 1980s with Solidarity, nor could they understand Gorbachev at all. So I went to the University of Wisconsin, and then through grappling with other philosophical, theoretical issues, was able to develop this different approach. I did my work. First book on the was in Poland from during the initial Solidarity movement in 1981, 82. Spent a lot of time there, and basically, since then have been going back to try to understand. In the first Solidarity experience, they were coming up with some new ideas about democracy, about civil society, which was important, I thought, again, for understanding politics in the West. That's how I approached that understanding of that. After the first book came out, I was even thinking for a while, like, why continue studying Poland or Eastern Europe after 1989? Then when I went back after a couple of years and saw that here was a society, of course, building capitalism, right? Because that became the major project, and realizing that, this is the very stuff of social science, how capitalism is being built, but how to do it how to understand it in a modern context, right? And that's when I saw this, these failure, right? Because liberals were in control after 1989. And then their policies that pauperized the working class, which meant the large variety of the population, was leading to right-wing reactions against that. So, then I continued to study that empirically, right, to try to see where are the issues, what is driving people who used to support a kind of left alternative, which I believe Solidarity was in the early 1980s, and how that came, how that all turned to the right. Finally, my work now called Red Pill Politics, basically about the, bringing lessons both from how Poland transformed and became so radically right, and trying to understand similar kind of developments with neglect, of course, of social welfare of the working class, with a turn to neoliberalism, how that leads to radical right-wing movements everywhere. So yeah, let me end with that for now and look forward to additional questions. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, David. I love the overlapping kind of trajectories and different histories, and there's so much I want to ask. But before we go on, our last but not least, we have Elena Gapova. So whenever you're ready, you can go ahead.
Well, I think I am. So, well, when I think, well, this is a big question. Tell us about your political trajectory. How did you come to leftism? So when I think about how this happened, I need first to begin with how I came to gender studies and explain this trajectory to the left. And my left critique has its roots in my own experience, in who I was and where I lived. And I need to begin with that anxiety that Soviet urban educated women, lots of them situated in academia, began to feel at some point at the very end of socialism during the perestroika. Somehow we felt, although we were very young, but the promise of gender equality had not been realized. Well, on the one hand, there was this unbelievable social welfare system, and when I explained to my American students all those benefits, and well, they just do not understand what I'm talking about, and they ask me, so do you mean that you have this credit to go to the university or something? But well, still we're seen a certain way, we as women. And we felt it and knew it, but we did not have any vocabulary to speak about it, about the women condition. And then somehow the term gender arrived. And the term gender came in all its glory because it came from the West. It came from Western academia and Western NGOs because the Iron Curtain fell and well, people began coming to the region. But at first, well, the word was there, but we didn't know how to define it, how to define the concept. And I remember Dasha Duhachik, who was the head of the Center for Gender Studies in Belgrade, said, but we at the center, at the university, we do not even define it. We just start teaching it and our students figure it out. But somehow that word responded to that anxiety that we had. And probably especially as our social sensibilities were sharpened by a huge social shift, a global shift of which we were a part of and of which our bodies were a part. Now, to cut a long story short, gender for us at the time stood for a lack of recognition of our autonomy and full humanity, and we did not want to be reduced to women mothers. We wanted more, as Betty Friedan used to write in her book, The Feminine Mystique, 30 years earlier, and that more meant careers and intellectual independence. And so I began doing gender studies, mostly touching in the dark, because lots of us drifted into this area without any previous training. And at first it felt like, well, what else? When I first came to the United States and went to the first big bookstore and asked someone there, well, do you know there's such a thing as women's studies? Can you show me where it is? And she took me to that shelf, and that shelf was from here to the horizon. And I was thinking, good God, all these words have already been produced. Is there something else I can really say? So that was the mood. And after some time, I was trying to do this. And after some time, it became apparent that in our country's nation building was on the way. And newly independent states were rewriting their stories and their histories as the plight for freedom. And of course, these were the stories of how they had been attacked or occupied. These national maidens were attacked or occupied or threatened by foreign rapists. So you can imagine all those flowers of evils that were beginning to bloom in that climate. Although, well, not every country who turned into an independent state with the deconstruction of the Soviet Union had actually asked for independence. But the rhetoric of nation building seemed to veil something crucial going on, which I would now call class formation. But at that time, I defined it as economic inequality. In front of our very eyes, segments of people were pauperized. The elderly were looking for food in garbage bins, but we were told that at least now we could vote for whoever we wanted, and we had freedom of speech. And that's how the concept of class was coming into my consciousness, and it wasn't easy to pronounce the word at first because it was a delegitimized word. Previously, of course, we had been fed on the diet of vulgar Marxism, but class and all that and means of production in the Soviet Union, it did not make sense. What is it all about? Where's this class? And in the 1990s, it began to change. And at some point, an aha moment arrived, and it became clear this is what Karl Marx was writing about. But then I spent several years really thinking about how class could be conceptualized in this new service and information economy, because this post-Soviet transition was not only to a new economic system, to the market, but also to a different system of production, to post-industrial and information society, and working class did not exist in the form it had existed before. And only when I added intellectuals and different forms of capitals to my work, then I could explain how late Soviet educational and other forms of capitals could be transformed into new delineations, and how this neoliberal post-industrial society pushed for particular lifestyles and politics of gender and class, and how one had to be available to potential employers 24/7 and market oneself through social media and be interesting, and how that was heavily gendered. So I wrote a lot on new class and its trajectory in post-socialism. And in the course of my work, I wanted to explain how the three, gender and class and nationhood, became entangled. And then at some point, some new questions began to arrive regarding the politics of gender and feminism. And at that time, of course, I was a feminist. I began that Center for Gender Studies at European Humanities University, but it was only possible to do with Western money, which at that time I did not question. Now, well, I'm older and wiser. So the politics of gender studies and feminism that we were doing somehow were not responding to the issues that common women all over the post-Soviet space were having. The issues of poverty, of the market economy, of the welfare state that was not prepared to deal with the new market situation. And then the question arrived, can it be that in certain situations, feminism can be the handmaiden of global capitalism? So that was, I cannot say that I wrote about that as well, although I cannot say that my writing on that issue was really welcomed in my part of the world. Well, but this is in my book, Klasy Nazi, the classes of nations. So, well, summing up, I can say that my drift to the left was shaped by the realities of the post-socialist condition.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for your introductory remarks. And there are already so many questions that were, I think, answered in your wonderful comments. My first question to all of my speakers, and feel free to jump out of turn since it doesn't necessarily have to be in any particular order. And I think some of you have already touched upon this a little bit, but how changing political climates and pivotal global events. So for instance, there was already discussion about 1968 and of course, 1989, 1991. But I'm also thinking about more kind of recent developments, the Occupy movement or Arab Spring, or 2017 to the present, the pandemic, whether how these changing political climates impacted the political climate in your field, and how did it impact the field and your own work? So anyone feel free to jump in on this question. Lewis, I think you're muted, sorry.
No, I wasn't think Louis started talking, but he was muted. But
Yeah,
is that-
so I'm not muted anymore. Just a very brief response, which is that for all the significance that we'd like to think events such as the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street had, what strikes me as, unfortunately more significant as far as to invoke Maria Todorova's point, the younger generation is concerned. And that's the trajectory of academia in general in the United States and perhaps to a lesser extent elsewhere in Europe. The shrinking of real positions in our field, especially in our field, but in general in the humanities. The burgeoning of the precariat. These are very distressing. My own son is a victim of this, and it's something to be combated with all of our energy.
maybe I'll just jump in. I think Louis is right in that, you mentioned these other events outside of 1989, outside of, the big events in Eastern Europe, how they transfer or, shape the field. And, I don't know. Yeah, I don't think that they have. I mean, in a sense, right? Arab Spring, 2017, Occupy. These are issues that occurred in the West that have shaped Western understanding. To somewhat, of course, Eastern Europe has become the West and tried to do so ever since 1991. Russia, of course, maybe it tried in 1991 for a year or so, but of course, Russia is Russia and somehow needs to stay something separate and different. Look, 1989, 1991, that whole period is one that reshaped the field dramatically. I mean, in the academy, others probably had the same experience, but someone teaching politics, I had huge interest in Russian Soviet politics in the late 80s when I started teaching. I had two courses, one separate on Soviet politics history, another one on Soviet foreign policy. By 1993, no one was taking any course, right? I mean, Russia was a basket case. Who cared? It wasn't a superpower. It had no impact. It was being pushed around by the United States, and it didn't seem to care that it didn't matter. And so students didn't want to take the courses, right? To lure them back, I had to add China to it, right? Russia and China in some kind of way, right? One might have thought, interestingly, that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia would dramatically bring back that interest. But I don't know if it's because of declining enrollments or maybe because of a kind of political climate today that perhaps young people want. I sort of have the sense that they want to cancel Russia in the sense like, I don't even want to take a course about it. I'm so not into it, right? So, it's, yeah, that doesn't seem to bring students back so much. So I think there's not really that much interest in it, but I think there are still such fascinating questions that and issues, and I'm always able to bring in those examples into my other courses that I teach.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed a lot of the same things that you talked about, but Maria, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I agree with both Louis and David that our field is endangered. And yet, since now I've been retired for 2 years and I'm on the keynote circuit, as it were, going here and there, especially in Europe, I meet really a very talented generation, which is actually very engaged and which has an interest. Yes, the situation is precarious. They struggle, particularly now with this project finding, so they don't have positions, especially in Europe. The only thing is that they go for projects which are short term, which means that they cannot really think it through. But nonetheless, there are really very talented people, especially in Germany, which is next to our region, and so they have to develop interest there. To the question of whether these things shape the field, I also don't think so, except that 1989 shaped the field in American academia because it was it was not budgeted any longer. It was not supported by all the institutions which before supported it because of the Cold War. But I think, speaking of new generations and their interest in left-wing politics, there I'm much more optimistic. Even while I was teaching, people were tremendously interested in Illinois in Marxism, in leftist readings, unofficially. So we would have reading groups, we would have private reading groups, or some special courses, again in terms of individual reading groups. And I think that right now, not so much Ukraine. I think a pivotal moment will be the Middle East, I think, for a new generation right now. I think this is what is big on the agenda.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, of course, 1991 was that moment of which has created this world for us, in which we have existed till the invasion of Ukraine began in 2022. And I cannot, as a person coming from the region, I just cannot even begin explaining to those who are not from there what a kind of a shock it was for all people, of course, but for the scholars of the region. And I think for almost 2 years, I almost stopped writing, thinking that, well, what else can I say? There's nothing that I can say because, well, we're producing all those texts, and now, well, you see what happened. So now somehow, and explaining the war, now I think the voice is coming back. But I also come from a somewhat different, I'm also looking at all this from a somewhat different perspective. For, well, strangely as it is, and it is strange, I work at the university where there are no Slavic studies, no Eurasian studies, etc. And I teach American students, and well, who know very little about history, about the outside world, and even about the American leftist movement. I have never met so far a student who knew who Paul Robeson was, or students, these days students do not recognize, for example, Che Guevara. Students in Michigan don't know about workers' movement in Michigan, in Detroit. They find about it from me. So I'm looking at this. Well, I'm not looking at Slavic studies or Eurasian studies or whatever we call it these days. I'm looking at this leftist field, and I understand that there are always going to be scholars and academics who will be writing about this. But I'm thinking about, well, this leftist politics is not just about writing; it's just participating in life. And well, it seems pretty gloomy at the moment.
say something? Um, First to Elena, I agree that Russians particularly were shocked, but the Russians who came out of Russia and that I meet nowadays who are shocked by what was happening, they are also doubly shocked by this crazy Russophobia which has taken up the field, which is also terrible. But I want to raise another question. Since we speak of leftism, I have a problem with this nomenclature. You know, what is left? What is leftism? To me, it's too broad. It is too diffuse a designator. In a way, it is a neutral designator. It's not about socialism. It's not about communism. It's not about anarchism. It doesn't have a program or goals. But aside from some general beliefs in social justice, defense of the underdog, the marginal, but what exactly is marginal? Because it's a positionality also. And perhaps in the belief in the amelioration of society, that it can become better, more humane, so which is essentially progressivism. I mean, leftism to me sounds almost like what Laclau and Mouffe was defining as equivalential chain or chain of equivalence, where you have these temporary alliances between people with very different views in order to oppose a given hegemony of the moment. And once they are successful, what happens, right? So I mean, this is a question open to everyone, actually.
No, I think that's a great point, and you're exactly right. Look, in the 1960s, there was no big right-wing threat, and so there were kind of, leftism meant then above all a critique of liberalism, right? And you could either be further on the left, you could be still pro-Soviet or pro-Chinese, right? And have that kind of program. And there wasn't a radical right. Today, since all of the political action, political innovation has come from the right, that the left has become very condensed, where it's become like a basic defense of basic liberal democratic rights. Theoretically, I've been learning more from studying the right, and new right ideas, whether it's all kinds of fascination, of course, by leftists and rightists with Carl Schmitt, or the work of those guys. He just gave a talk at my university yesterday. This guy Patrick Deneen, who is one of the ideologues of someone like Josh Hawley or C.D. Vance, who claim to be really pro-working class supporters of Trump, and can those two be separated at all? I mean, it totally blows open, this question of right and left. But that's where I think we need to grapple with and learn from now.
I think we should open it up for questions.
Yeah, I agree. You all made my job way too easy. I barely have to moderate at all. Yeah, let's start off with some questions from the audience. I know that there was a hand before. Yeah, go ahead. Go, Tom, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I couldn't resist, given this rich descriptions by so many eminent scholars of their time spent in the region. So I couldn't resist in a bit of show and tell. This is the book by Zeman called Prague Spring, which was gifted to me by Madhu Kishwar, who's one of India's, very maverick socialist feminist activists who actually spent time in Prague at that time. So she gifted this to me. So I was actually, before today, I had a look at it again. It's very torn and tattered. And I was actually very surprised to revisit what Professor Zeman wrote in this book back then, because he was looking at, he was trying to do, so the main thread of his argument in the book,
Sounds like an interruption from don't expect much from the end of the world.
right, right.
We love a Zoom bomber.
Sorry, I was, yeah. Anyway, so,
Wow.
so what I wanted to say was that one of the arguments that, so what Professor Zeman is saying in the book is that both arguments on both sides of the Prague Spring debates stayed rooted within the quote-unquote left socialist discourse. So it was not that, I mean, this dimension which we nowadays don't look at that much is during the Cold War, as I think the previous discussion focused, what the previous discussion highlighted, there was not much of a there was practically no right-wing populist discourse to speak of, in the sense there were no such figures. So the entire fight was between, I remember in the debates going on in communist circles in India, if you look at in the 60s, the CPI versus the CPIM. Those of you who know Indian communism would know that the split was on pro-Soviet and pro-China lines. Now, in this entire debate, what happens is you see a complete removal from socialist left discourses of the existence of a right wing at that time, which I think today would be very difficult to do, right? Because as some speakers have also noted, we have to take into account the fact that a lot of quote-unquote left progressive discourses have been usurped and instrumentalized by forces which have got nothing to do with the left. I'm resisting the temptation to refer to American politics because that's very clear, but also in places like, for example, Italy or France, or, places where I come from. I don't want to get too direct on this, but we see a lot of typical Marxist positioning being deployed in rhetoric which is absolutely neoliberal in its economic content. So my question to all of you would be, how does it really, can it really help left discourse today to engage with quote unquote theoretical discourses, if there are any, of course, that's also something, on the other side? Because I think it might help for, left discourse to engage with the very real existence of usurpation technology, usurpation techniques and usurpation strategies against people who are bent on destroying the left. And I'm not saying that, I don't know if I can claim to be a leftist, but I certainly value the discursive rigor and the ideological integrity which the quote-unquote left brings to academic and social debates. Thank you so much. Sorry for the long question.
Shall we
can you give some examples? Yeah. No, I was just wondering, can you give examples of people who have usurped this Marxist vocabulary for right-wing purposes? That's to Gautam.
I would respond by saying that I'm going to disagree with Maria Todorova's complaint about leftism by saying that I think we should engage with whatever the right is throwing at us. Better to have a broad and admittedly ill-defined sense of being together as on the left than to engage in what the left became notorious for from the 30s at least onwards, which was factionalism and friction and little groupuscules, as the French used to say, and divisions that took our eye off the main enemy. And the main enemy, and this is what I would throw back at the right, is capitalism, in a word. And that dirty little word needs to be emphasized again and again, because it is one from which liberals and the right run away from.
Maria, Gautam, do you want to respond to Maria's question? Mm-hmm. I think you're muted, sorry.
Yeah, now I can. So
okay.
it was centrally muted. Thank you so much, Professor Todorova, for that. I was actually, when I said that, I was thinking in terms of political usurpation. So I don't have clear examples of academic usurpation, because I think it's safe to say that the quote-unquote right wing doesn't have stellar academics to compete with the left. But I mean, I think that's not a secret. But I was thinking in terms of worker discontent, which is being usurped throughout the quote-unquote West. I mean, if we see, I think it's now called the Rassemblement, Le Pen's movement, Rassemblement. I think it's changed its name. And then we also have Matteo Salvini in Italy. And if we look at the PIS party in Poland, if we look at Fidesz, if we look at Orban's party, if we look at also certain elements of the German quote-unquote right, we see 3 new parties which have been established, as I'm sure all of you know, in the German electoral landscape. And 2 of them are clearly very right-wing. For example, the AfD, and it's not a new party, but it's there. And there's something called the Werte Union. Now, in this 2, the Werte Union is a very typical revanchist, old school, conservative, socially conservative, bordering on maybe some very neo-national socialist ideas. But the AfD keeps swimming back and forth between workers' discontent, instrumentalizing workers' discontent, as does Le Pen, as does Salvini, and the others. And I think it's very interesting. What is for me very interesting, and I'll just end here. What is very interesting for me is how these discourses tie in with how they sort of conflate an ideological economic critique of American hegemony, American economic and other forms of hegemony in Europe and all the rest of the world. But it also goes back to a pre-1945 European nationalist distrust of transatlantic power. So a lot of things are conflating there, and the fault lines are sort of vanishing. So I was wondering if that's relevant to our discussion. Thank you.
Maria, go ahead.
Muted.
Yeah, I think you're muted. I'm not sure.
Okay, now. So thank you, Gautam. To Luis, I identify as leftist, so there is no problem with that. All I'm saying is that pronouncing solidarity doesn't help. In fact, countries which really have left-wing politics, like Greece, for example, which I know pretty well, are totally fragmented in terms of different fractions of leftism, and that's the tradition of left-wing of leftism from the beginning on. Somebody here in the chat is saying, look back to the French Revolution. I mean, look through all the 19th century revolutions in France. Look at the Marxist movement. It is all fragmented. So, I mean, when we come to the politics, and here Gautam is right. So we have to be clear: are we speaking about academia or about politics? I mean, yes, I would say something very banal. Politics is everything is political, but then the question is how we choose to implement this thing, everything is political. Do we do it by writing, or do we do it by organized action? And this depends on circumstances, on possibilities. And I was trying to say that we come with different experiences and different possibilities in front of us when we were young and could organize politically. I mean, I've had my political engagement in '68. I had it then when you know, in the anti-Turkish moment, and then in 2003, right, engaging in the anti-war movement here in Iraq. And guess what? I'm part of a department which is considered to be very liberal, very left-wing, very educated. And I was the only one in the street protesting against the Iraq war. Of course, hoping that these protests and these demonstrations would bring something, because I had the illusion that this was a practical move. There were demonstrations in millions who were protesting. And of course, in Champaign, where do you protest? You protest at the big mall. So I was joking that we were shoppers for peace, but nonetheless, we protested. And none of my very liberal colleagues were out in the streets. But they are very politically correct nowadays when it comes to identitarian politics. So again, we have to, you know, weigh different forms of leftism. So not everyone is a tribune. Marxists were tribunes. Marx himself was not. He was an armchair Marx, right? He was a writer. So, I mean, people engage in different ways with leftism, but absolutely, I'm on this side of the barricade. There is no question about that.
Rasen, go ahead.
Thank you all, and it was really, to me, very interesting how the political trajectories that Luis and David delineated were, in a sense, quite different from Elena's and Maria's, and inevitably so, even if, to be honest, this wasn't really something we put much thoughts into when constructing the panel. But you know, David and Luis you know, went through a kind of politicization very common for US academics, even though, of course, there's nothing common about you. But I still want to, and I think the East European case represented by Maria and Elena is a maybe more complex one and a belated one, if you forgive this, you know, belated embrace of the left. It's a, you know, admittedly very category. But I wanted to ask Maria specifically about, you know, your use of generations. You know, it was very, you know, helpful, and yet, you know, it still doesn't explain the fact that you're one of the very few Bulgarian historians who is certainly of your generation who would identify themselves, you know, as leftist. You know, I can only think of Siegelbaum. Maybe there are more. I'm certainly not a professional historian. And I'm, of course, a little more hopeful about later generations, and I wonder whether you share this optimism of later cohorts of East European historians. But to me, as an intellectual formed in the generation you were formed, you're quite exceptional in your leftist position, and to this day, Bulgarian historiography is right now dominated by people who have largely erased a lot of the history you've written about in your book, for example, on the lost world of socialists, Bulgarian socialism. So sorry for this convoluted question, but I'm just wondering, say specifically to Maria, about your difference from your generation, and how come you're so atypical politically.
Oh, I don't know, because I've been always very contrary. But this is a personal thing. It's not only Iskrabaeva, you have Zhenya Kalinova, you have other people who, at this point, some of them don't have the courage. Some it's just some are speaking in the smaller circles of my generation. As for the new generation, the ones around Diversia, last summer I was at a conference in Sofia on 1923, and it came out in Jacobin what I had to say about permanent revolution and what was going on in the 1920s. The younger generation is interesting, but it is also completely fragmented. They quarrel with each other all the time. I mean, it's pretty terrible. So and again, Elena was evoking Western money. Their Western money may come from nice sources, not CIA. Because somebody rightly said, the CIA was CIA and Solidarity were also in cahoots at one point. But and in this case, they're receiving funds from the Friedrich Ebert Society or the Rosa Luxemburg Society, and according their politics are also shaped by the monies that they receive. I mean, I'm more hopeful. Essentially, look, when it comes to scholarship, of course, political commitments shape one's preference, but still, to me, the most important thing is critical reasoning, critical engagement, and also rigorous and meticulous scholarship. So politics are an additional component to that, as far as academia goes.
Great. Greg, you have a hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks. So I wanted to ask, it seems like one of the features of maybe a younger or newer generation of the campus left has been focusing on on-campus struggles around unionization, around divestment, and questions like that. So what's your impression of your own, I guess, your own generation's involvement with these kinds of efforts, either in the past or now? Because, of course, I've heard lots of horror stories about venerable labor historians who pushed a very socialist line in their books, turning out to be union busters in practice when these things reach their departments. So what are your experiences with that? Thank you.
So I was an undergraduate at Columbia University between 1966 and 70, and those were hot years, and nothing has quite matched the intensity of campus protests that I participated in since. But that said, I think it's a mixed bag, and I referred to my son earlier. He's been very active in unionization efforts among adjuncts. He's been very active in supporting Palestinians most recently, and that's a pretty widespread phenomenon, and somewhat encouraging. Although the backlash that both of those efforts have caused is needless to say disturbing. I think unfortunately history tells us that it's horrible events such as wars, invasions, and mass economic collapse that provokes. I think this is where I'm going to invoke my Leninism to say that, in the absence of some form of political organization, I'm very much influenced by this book, If We Burn. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this, Victor Bevan's book of recent times. It's clear that all of these initiatives throughout the world, from Arab Spring, Brazil, elsewhere that he writes about, lacked, as he emphasizes, political structure and organization and a willingness to have something in the form of, dare I say, even hierarchy, in order to curb the kind of diffuseness and then appropriation by the right that has emerged in so many of these places.
Does anyone else want to chime in on this question? I should also note that we have a relevant upcoming Black Sheep Society Symposium on the topic of grad student and adjunct organizing and labor. Do we have a date for that, by the way? I know that the date was mentioned, but I failed to mention it in my introductory comments. If Rossen, what do you want to do a quick plug?
It would be May the 3rd at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern.
Great.
David?
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I'm muted now. No, I just want to say we've covered a number of different topics here. I wanted to say something earlier, about those right wingers who try to appropriate left ideas. Of course, there's the innovation of the Elena Benoit, right, and the Nouvelle Voie, right, the new right, explicitly adopting this what they call this right wing groundism.
Sorry, David, I'm sorry to interrupt you. There's a bit of an echo.
Yeah.
Do you know if anything could be wrong with or something's going on with the mic, or maybe if you turn it off and on again, or
I'll turn it. Is this better? No. We go to another room. I have no idea. Let me just go downstairs. Still bad?
David, what you might try doing is just turn off the sound on your computer temporarily. You won't be able to hear us for the moment, but you can turn it back on once you're done talking. That might work.
Okay, I turned off the sound. Can you hear me better?
No, it's the same. Okay,
No,
I'm
no.
not sure.
Sorry, you can't hear me better. Let me.
yeah, I like the question, the comment in the comments that's like, oh, the CIA did it again. Let's just blame the CIA for the tech issues and make our lives a little better. CIA, darn, you did it again.
Still bad, right? If not,
Maybe if you want to type it out, and then one of us can recite it. That might be a little bit easier. Do we have any other comments or questions? I know I definitely have more. Or if anyone on of our panelists has anything to add that hasn't been discussed yet. I think a good question to kind of continue, and I think this is something that a few people have already been talking about in terms of the next generation or just media works. I love that, Louis, you talked about the Radu Yuda film that's coming out right now. But I would love to know if there was something that gives you hope or inspires you about what is happening right now, whether that's, it could be media works, it could be particular people, something potentially inspirational in your field, outside of the field, just things that are inspiring to you that are happening right now. So anyone can feel free to jump in.
Louis, you have to unmute yourself.
Uh-huh.
There you
Thank
go.
you. I mentioned Bevan's book a few moments ago. There are others that are sitting on my shelf that I've recently read, all of which seem to be written by people who are generations, shall I say, younger than I. And that gives me hope in itself. A Danish Marxist, Søren Mao, wrote a book called Mute Compulsion that I learned so much from. About what capitalism does. It's a very densely Marxist book. A much more accessible book is Quinn Slobodian's Crack Up Capitalism, which I also learned a great deal from. So that there are these creative people producing such good work in and of itself, it gives me hope. On the other hand, I'll stop here. I think we are facing, let's get real. We are facing challenges that in my younger days I could not have imagined the seriousness of. And I'm talking about fascism. The more we can do to figure out the best way of combating it, the better.
Elena, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to the work that Vladimir Ishchenko has been doing. Vladimir Ishchenko, he often writes with Oleg, together with Oleg Zhirabov, trying to make sense of this post-Soviet situation and the Ukrainian war, this Marxist or class approach to explaining for most of the other explanations that I've been, hearing for the last 2 or 3 years have been, about this nationalism, Russian nationalism, or Ukrainian nation building, or this or that. And Vladimir is looking at this from this class perspective, which is really rich and interesting.
Great. Maria, go ahead. Maria, I think you need to unmute. Sorry.
I'm unmuting myself. I partly touched on this when I voiced my objection to this very diffuse notion of leftist. But in fact, interesting and potentially leftist work can be done also by non-leftists. So I'm not a political scientist, so I'm moving much back into history before Marxism was born, 17th to 18th century. But some of my graduate Ottomanist students, which are not on the left, are producing very interesting Marxist, if not explicitly Marxist, and work on environmental history or on socioeconomic history. So that to me is very welcome. And essentially, I welcome any direction in my discipline, even though such démodé fields like political and diplomatic history, which I don't practice myself, if they have the twin merits of critical thinking and rigorous and meticulous professionalism. So these are my criteria for good scholarship.
Great. David, go ahead.
Just gonna try. Is it better? Not all laid out comment. No better.
Sorry. Although, you know what? Maybe we can try if you see what happens if.
I would try to talk slowly, David.
Okay. I was going to comment about how the a lot of right-wing thinkers have been using some left ideas, beginning with the French New Right, the so-called Nouvelle Droit of Alain Benoit, who adopted this idea of right-wing Gramscianism, as he calls it, a reaction against the huge advances that the left generally made in social in Western common sense after World War II. And so they're trying to challenge it to bring smuggle in their own ideas. Right. Benoit is famous for taking this idea of the left to have the difference, right? Viva la difference, and use that to say that immigrants and others to help them don't belong in Western societies. They ought to have their own communities. But that's a kind of defense of minorities against leftist multiculturalism. The other point I was going to say just about the field is how that's been transformed so beneficially by the presence of so many of the people here, namely young scholars from Eastern Europe. I taught at Central European University in Warsaw in 1980, in the late 1990s for a couple of years, and I taught a course titled Western Marxism and Western Social Science, because most all of my former Soviet bloc students didn't want to hear anything about any kind of Marxism. And as a consequence, they couldn't do social science. They didn't understand the real contributions that Marxist approaches had made. Now, as capitalism came to Eastern Europe, right, many in the region found Marxism or left approaches relevant, which is not surprising in a capitalist society. And I think these work, right? I'm so excited by works of younger East Europeans reimagining their own societies or analyzing that. One of my favorite recent books is Zizka, Valia-Vicharska's wonderful book called Restless History about Bulgaria, but about how revisionists, anti-Stalinists in Bulgaria brought back that kind of nationalist emphasis that has given such that radical right-wing parties now take on, right? So these kinds of approaches by I mean, that's why I learned so much from the socialism and barbarism panels and from Black Sheep panels in the future, right? And I just want to encourage those who are listening. I mean that you're the one who really have so much to bring to us, right? By grappling with that history you know so well, bringing in some of these different ideas. So I'll stop there.
Great. And I think that's a really lovely note to end on. And I apologize to anyone that had other things to say. I know that the chat was really kind of rich with discussion. And it was really fun to watch and participate in. So I want to again thank you to all of our incredible roundtable and symposium participants. I I can only speak for myself, but I think I speak for everyone else here when I say that it's just been wonderful to hear from you and to hear about your experiences. Thanks to everyone for your participation. Please do come back next month on May 3rd. And thanks also to all of the suggestions for future events. I think that we're all, looking at all of these ideas, and I'm sure we'll keep all of this in mind. And please do sign up for the Google group and the social media platforms. And if none of my organizers want to say anything else, then I think we can end there and just thank everyone for their participation.
I'll just say thank you to Julia as well for hosting. This is very much fun.
My pleasure. All right. Thank you so much to everyone.